They're defending their viewpoint. And in fact, it's protected by the Constitution, the right to petition, the right to protest. Next to that, in the time that our democracy is living through, when groups use extreme violence in order to attack representatives, be they MPs or mayors, unfortunately every week, when they resort to violence without any rule whatsoever because they're unhappy with things, it's no longer the Republic.
I apologize for that. That was actually President Macron speaking about the protesters. I want to bring back in Yves Saint-Omer. I heard you beginning to respond to that previous question about the anger that the French public must feel. Do you think that people who are protesting in the streets feel heard by President Macron?
No, clearly not. I mean, it was more what we call in French, un fin de non-recevoir. You don't want to hear the protest and to want to go forward and turn the page. I mean, we'll see what happens in the next days, but the probability of violent protest will raise. Too many people are really unhappy with what is going on, and they have good reason for this, because they have the feeling that democracy has not worked. And we have to shift the way of making politics, and we have to shift the system in France. Otherwise, I think that our democracy, which is actually under threat, will become will go in a very dangerous situation.
Mark Perlman, I mentioned this earlier. Macron saying that he's willing to accept unpopularity over this whole pension reform, his popularity dipping to 28%. Do you see that changing? This is just something he's willing to accept.
He's willing to accept this, first of all, because he doesn't have a choice, and he knows he's not up for re-election. He mentioned it, actually, in the interview as a justification for doing that unpopular reform. He said, people might not like it. What he's hoping is that people will eventually understand it, that it was needed for financial purposes. So yes, this is his hope. He also knows that he has 4 years to go, so his popularity might only be temporary, and that he might rebound if there are other issues. That's why he's so eager to turn the page. That he said, and it's true. That's absolutely true. In history, those reform of the pension system, because this reform touches everyone. And so you essentially know that it's going to be painful and controversial, and there are going to be strikes and demonstrations. There have been strikes and demonstrations against every reform of the pension system, including the one that was much more consensual by Emmanuel Macron himself during his first mandate, when he had an absolute majority in Parliament. And despite that, there were days, weeks of demonstrations. This was cut short by COVID in March 2020, but there was already a very strong opposition. So Emmanuel Macron basically is saying, history tells us that it's not going to be easy, but some of those reforms have been implemented, including raising the retirement age. For example, in 2010, from 60 to 62, there were weeks of demonstrations. People tend to forget, but he's hoping that eventually this will be accepted. There might be one thing that could intervene, is the Constitutional Constitutional Council, as it's known here, is currently reviewing the bill. The Prime Minister asked the Constitutional Council to do this, as well as opposition parties. And there's a possibility that the Council might consider, first of all, the way this reform was presented in Parliament. This is a bit technical, but it was essentially presented as a financial text. And therefore, the government used several articles of to hasten the discussion in Parliament. And some might say this is not a financial text. It goes beyond purely financial aspects. So it might be deemed at least partially unconstitutional. So that might be something that could happen. And this is why Emmanuel Macron said, I want to see this implemented by the end of this year, because he knows There could be hurdles, and that could change the equation again. But for now, at least, Emmanuel Macron has said, I want this to go through. People might not like it. They might not like me. They might see me as someone who's doing something that's harmful to them. But eventually, he hopes they will recognize that it was needed, and they will accept it, and eventually tell me in a few years that I was right and that they were wrong. But for now, this is not how it's perceived by a majority of the French, and not how it's perceived by the unions.
And before we let you go, Yves Saint-Omer, I want to have you weigh in on what we were just hearing there from Mark Perlman. Do you think the Constitutional Council will provide some final hurdles to this law actually going into effect by the end of the year as the French president wants it to?
Here it's a borderline situation, and the Constitutional Council could say that the process which has led to the adoption of the law is not constitutional, at least partly. This said, because it's borderline, the decision can be yes or no, and we'll see. To some extent, one could hope that the Constitutional Council will say it's not constitutional, because it would be a possibility to open the floor again to a real deliberation, to a much better process. But let's see.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Yves Saint-Omer, Professor of Political Science, University of Paris. Vincent Saint-Denis, thanks so much for joining us here on France 24. Of course, thanks to our French politics editor, Mark Perlman, for helping us navigate all of this afternoon.